All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to whoever you are. New person, returning friend, whichever you may be. I'm grateful to you. Thank you for listening today. I hope this finds you in good spirits. And if it doesn't, if you're not in good spirits, perhaps this show can provide you some healthy distraction. And maybe even, who knows, by the time you're done listening, maybe you'll have a different kind of perspective point and it won't seem as bad. Who knows? I'm not making any promises. It's just a wishful thought. If you haven't been around lately, you might not have heard this, but I made some comments about wanting to change my relationship to screens and the internet and feeling freaked out by how much of my life involves just me and a laptop compared to 4 years ago and wanting to see if I can find new ways, as I said, or new relationships to it. And I realized something. I realized that it isn't about finding a new something, that actually it's about a return to something, because I did know life before the internet. Not everybody listening to this may be in that case. I know a lot of you are. Some of us did have times in our life when there was an internet and we did things differently. And I look back on those times and I go, wow, see, there was another point in my life where I went about my days in a different manner than I do now. And I have that in me. I can return to those patterns. And it's funny, that makes me feel like, am I conservative? Am I becoming more conservative as I get older? They always say that happens, right? I remember my dad saying that to me in college, as you get older, you'll get more conservative. But to me, that's not the right word, because conserve means like to keep something in place or to be, frugal about its use, to conserve it. But what I'm talking about is already gone. There's nobody living in more analog ways. Although that's not true. I'm sure there are plenty of people on the planet who aren't spending as much time on the internet as me. I guess what I was talking about was wanting to call people on the phone and talk to them instead of sending text. We had a whole conversation about that in my teacher's Sangha the other week, that a lot of us like to have the texting as opposed to having to actually call someone. Like having to call someone seems like this huge effort. But just shooting off texts, it's like, and my kids are like all about the text. Nobody does email anymore. And me, I like to think of email like writing a letter. It's like a digital letter. And then I think of text as like a quick, I'll be there in 5 kind of thing. If we're like on the run in the car or something and I need to let someone know. But I'm not like writing big, long things in texts. I don't know. So all of this is to say that I feel like it's maybe not so much about forging a completely new thing. Like there are new things about it because we're in this whole new world. But in some regards, it's about relating to life in ways that I did in the past. It's not anything new. So something about not throwing all the babies out with the bathwater as I look back into history, Finding the good things about my past and about the way life was in other times and utilizing that for now. And I would say that my conversation today with Kamini Desai is very much in this spirit. If you don't know who Kamini Desai is, she's the daughter of Amrit Desai, and his name has come up on the show a number of times. He was a spiritual head of what became Kripalu, and I've mentioned it only a few times, and always in a context that was referencing the fall from grace that sometimes is associated with him as is associated with a lot of almost every figure I can think of who at one point was a spiritual head of like a larger institution or organization or even like huge group of people, that at some point, anytime there was someone who had that kind of position of power, there always came a time where it didn't live up to the idealized pedestals and hopes of some of the aspirants. And a lot of it resulted in horrible abuses and all kinds of things. And I often throw them all in together, all the gurus who fell from grace, like one thing. And I don't think that's a very healthy way to consider these people or what's happened in our past. And I've been looking for more nuanced ways to consider these things, and this conversation with Kamini became this perfect opportunity. So I was very happy to have had this opportunity to talk with Kamini, and I'm very glad to share it with you today. And real quick before we get to it, I do want to express gratitude to podcast premium subscribers. Specifically today, I want to say thank you to Robert Shabasan and Morton Ronning. Cheers to you, Robert and Morton. Thank you so much for your contribution to the well-being of this show. And to anyone else listening who is not aware, the most recent 52 episodes of this show are always available in their full length on our public feed. We do also have a podcast premium subscription, which is the way that people support and help keep the show going and get access to the complete archives. So if you've been listening and you appreciate what you're hearing here, we are asking you to become part of supporting it, and we're grateful to everyone who's already doing that. To learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber, along with all of the other things that I do, I have online classes and group discussions that you can also be a part of if you want. Everything that I'm doing, along with this show and everything else, can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I think that's good. I will touch base with you on the other side, as I am off to do. But for now, let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Kamini Desai. Hello?
Hi.
Hi, Kamini. Nice to meet you.
You too.
Thank you so much. Let me just say, I am already recording, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to think of us having just begun.
Of course, of course.
All right, cool. Thank you so much. And also, just thank you for making this time. I know there's a lot going on. You mentioned in your email and that you made this time for me and the show. It's just, I really appreciate that you did that. Thank you.
Of course, and I appreciate you being flexible with me. It's all the human stuff, right?
Really, it is. And it kind of very much goes to why you're here. Like maybe as a way of getting us started, I would first share with you where I kind of want to end up today, which is not normally something I ever do with someone. But what happened was this morning, I was doing some last minute preparations, getting ready to talk to you. And I watched a video that you made, and there was this huge synchronicity. Because I had a conversation yesterday with a group of people in my online teacher training. It was a very intense conversation about energy and spirit and consciousness. And we were struggling to find good language for it. And then this morning, I watched a video of you talking about these things and having very clear language about it. So some really big light bulbs went off. So I definitely want to talk with you about that today. But before we do that, I feel like I don't want to start there, because the main reason I brought you here, why I recently reached out is, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, but I was in a meeting last week, and someone brought your name up. I think someone had done a yoga Nidra practice with you. And they said, have you ever looked into what Kamini Desai is doing? And I said, who's that? They said, that's Amrit Desai's daughter. And I said, I didn't even know Amrit Desai had a daughter. And then I felt kind of surprised by that, because I certainly know the name Kamini Desai, but I don't actually know that much about him. I only know, scandalous stories or whatever.
Yes.
So in any case, one of the reasons I started this show was because I'm somebody who came into yoga in the early 90s in New York City. And I watched it kind of get mainstreamed, And when I started the show, I was just asking this question of like, how did we get here? How did we get from the yoga classes I remembered in the early 90s, where there was definitely chanting in every class, and the only way you had credibility was really to cite your teacher and the lineage tradition that you were like associated with, to 2010, when there was like all this Instagram yoga happening or whatever.
Yeah.
So I was like trying to say, how did we get here? And so a lot of the show has been about wanting to do some kind of oral history and kind of figure out where things came from. And then the idea that I had such a kind of gap in my knowledge of Kamini Desai and what he taught or what he teaches. And also, I would say I had like conflicting information, because I taught at Kripalu over the years. And when I first taught there, I never remember anybody saying anything about a Swami Kripalu. But then later on, they did talk about a Swami Kripalu. But when I looked it up, it's actually a much longer name, Kripalu. So I'm like, is that the same person? So all of this is a little bit of a long-winded way, maybe just to say that I feel like you might be able to fill some gaps for me and for the show. And so that's one of the things I wanted to start with. And I read that you were born at one of the ashrams. Is that right?
I was born, it was the very first, it was called the Yoga Society of Pennsylvania. Started in Philadelphia when my dad was still an art student, actually. And then grew up in the subsequent ashrams, the ones that started in Pennsylvania, and then so on.
Okay. And now I was reading some, and like I said, I don't always trust Wikipedia pages, frankly. They've failed me in the past. But as I read that your dad did study with a Swami Kripalu, and it was like a Kundalini yoga. Is that right?
That's right. So my father was 16 years old at the time when he met his teacher, who as Swami Kripalu or Swami Kripalu Ji or Swami Kripalu. Yes, they're all the same person.
Okay.
And he was a traveling monk, traveling around that part of India, teaching on the Bhagavad Gita. And both my dad and mom, they were betrothed at the time, but they knew each other, but they didn't socialize with each other. But they both loved who we called Bapuji, and Bapuji just means beloved father. And so they would, all the shopkeepers in the town would close down their stores, and they would all go listen to Swami Kripalu Bapuji. And my dad loved him, and at 16 years old would try to get as close to him as he could. But, being a teenager, there would be like 20,000 people who would come to see him. They would just kind of push him out of the way. But one day, my dad, who had kind of taught himself, he was a real sporty kind of person, and he would teach himself yoga postures off a poster on a gym wall. Now, it's not our kind of gym. It's a cement room with barbells. But he was really into the physicality of it, and so taught himself all these poses, and was one day outside kind of showing off to his friends, do this, and kind of being the yoga teacher to them. And Bapuji Swami Kripalu actually came out of his meditation room and saw my father teaching his friends and saw something in him. And so he said, tomorrow, come to my meditation room and I will show you where yoga actually originally came from. And so that was actually their first real meeting. And that's when he showed my father this kind of meditation in motion, this energy yoga that arises spontaneously from within in deep states of meditation.
So when you say that, are you saying that it isn't a set form, that it's more of like a improvised movement or just a movement that happens spontaneously?
Well, the idea is with what we call Kripalu Yoga, or this approach to energy yoga. It is based in Kundalini, absolutely, that energy and consciousness are connected, and that the deeper we go into states of stillness, the more of that energy, which is the manifest counterpart of that stillness, begins to awaken. So that energy and consciousness, the more we go into stillness, the more energy awakens. The more energy awakens, more we go into stillness. And so what we do in this kind of approach is going into deep, deep states of stillness and allowing then the awakened energy to guide first just very small movements, jerks, impulses, just a feeling of the body, like I need to go here, I want to go there. And then eventually that inner voice, that energy becomes strong enough that it begins to guide our movement even ahead of the mind, that the mind takes a back seat to what the intelligence of the body is telling us to do.
It's very interesting. And that's not necessarily what I knew to be Kripalu Yoga, I guess.
No. Well, and there are preliminary stages to that, which is probably what you know of. Yeah.
I see. So that's more of like where you end up, but there's maybe like a starting point or a entry point that's more like what your dad was doing when he was doing poses off of the poster, or what's the kind of entry points towards, or is it about like basic poses and then that leads to the kind of awarenesses so that you then have practices more like you were describing?
You have it exactly. So the idea is that we start with more willful poses that sort of build the container, help us kind of hold the energy that we're about to release. And that's more like what we know from typical traditional yoga poses, which then sets the stage for energy awakening and the capacity of the body to hold greater amounts of this divine energy, this prana within our system.
Well, let's put a pin in divine energy and prana.
Okay, it's going a little big.
No, because that's like I said, where I want to go at the end. Well, not at the end, but I want to get there. What I would say is I'm intrigued by that idea of the forms at some point being more expressive of what you feel in the moment and the energies that you feel, and the divinity in that kind of practice, which is different than what a lot of people think of as like asana practice or like more fitness orientation for sure. I guess I'm curious, you said your dad, when he was young, he had this experience, but then as I understand it, he came to America to study art, as you said. Is that right?
That's right. So after, he saw this kind of meditation and motion experience, he sort of forgot about it, went to the States. He continued to be a devotee, as Swami Kripalu, but just went on with his regular householder life until one day he was teaching a regular traditional yoga class like we all do. And in the background, there was chanting from his teacher, Swami Kripalu, playing. And somehow it brought him into this mode where suddenly his inner energy awakened. And so from that, it kind of put him on the path where he eventually let go of his studies, his art studies, and really dove deeper into understanding what this deeper aspect of yoga was all about.
So that's very intriguing as well. We've talked about this on the show where people have like a feeling of inner knowing about something that guides them. Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like that happened to your dad. And then that's when he started, like you said, there was the first kind of just an association in Pennsylvania for yoga, right? Which ended up leading to kind of growing to the ashrams. How did the history go of those ashrams forming?
Yeah, so he started with the Yoga Society of Pennsylvania, I'm going to say like 1968, something like that, right around the time I was born, maybe 1970. And he was teaching, he and his brother, and he had taught also a number of yoga teachers. And back in the 60s, this was, yoga was not a big known thing. So he had or was overseeing about 50 yoga teachers running about 150 classes in the Philadelphia area. And then after his awakening experience, he was like, you know what? I just want to go inside for myself. I want to go deeper into these practices. And so he gave those classes away for the most part and just was living in what was called Sumneytown, Pennsylvania, with just a few people. I think it was 7 people who started. And, just doing daily practices and living a lifestyle, having a garden that they were growing food from and eating from. My mom did all the cooking and cleaning, and they just kind of started like that as a small little yoga community. And then at some point, more people started hearing, more people started coming, and that place got too small. And then they went to another place in Pennsylvania. And then eventually that got too small. And that's when they moved up to Kripalu, in Massachusetts, where it is today.
Right. That was in 1983, I wrote down.
Yes.
If that's right. If Wikipedia's got it right.
Yes.
So I guess, how old were you when you moved to Massachusetts? Do you remember?
Yes. So I was about 15 years old when we moved to Massachusetts. 15, 16.
And were you like being taught yoga from a young age? Was it expected, or did you rebel and not want to do the pranayama exercises? Or
can I choose
was it like
all
being
of the
a
above?
kid at the ashram,
Yeah. So as a kid, so in the old days, the place that we had our evening sessions was in a room, and below it was an old converted garage. That's where we lived. And so the satsangs or the evening sessions were above us, myself and my 2 brothers. And so every night and every morning we would have these sessions, and I would fall asleep in my mother's lap as my dad would be teaching, or we would be chanting and those kinds of things. So I definitely grew up with it. It was definitely got into my psyche from a very young age. And then I'm not going to lie, there was a point at which I was like, enough of all this yoga stuff. I just want to be a regular teenager and do my thing. And, convinced in my, when 18, 19 years old, that of course I knew better than everybody else, and that, all that I'm going to change the world my own way kind of thing. But eventually I think my own journey, going away from all of that, being on my own, I found myself getting depressed and disconnected, and I think many of the things that young people face. And it was then that I kind of rediscovered the teachings for myself. I picked them up because I didn't have a choice. I needed them.
Well, I read that you went on to get some degrees, like in science. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, I went on to get a PhD in psychology. So, at first I was going to be a diplomat, and then I got very disillusioned with peace process. And realized that the teachings of yoga are really all about starting with peace inside, and so I kind of came back around and started teaching these teachings, but realized that there's such a strong connection between, in my mind, yoga and psychology. They're saying a lot of the same things in different languaging, but that the languaging that we use, yogic and scientific, can both inform each other so that we understand the teachings of yoga better.
I think that's true. But it also, earlier in this conversation, you referenced prana and divinity, and sometimes the world of psychology and the language of psychology doesn't always leave room for those things. So I think you're right. I think there's certainly like overlaps in the Venn diagram there or whatever, but at the same time, there's maybe still some distinctions that need to be made also when we look at larger purposes, I suppose.
For sure. Yeah. And, it's interesting because you'll see, I'm thinking of bioenergetics or, things that are not necessarily considered mainstream psychology, but definitely a pointing to an inner energy or, something that's streaming and moving through our body that has a wisdom and intelligence of its own, that when we work with it can heal the body for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, like I said, we'll come back to the wisdom and intelligence that exists on its own, because that's the heart of the conversation we were having yesterday.
Yes.
But I guess I'm also now curious to hear. So you do strike out on your own. You're like, like right now I have 2 daughters and I'm a yoga teacher, and I've never tried to do yoga with them, but like you, it's around all the time and they know, but I kind of have this, I imagine like they're going to like become investment bankers or something to like rebel against me, which might not be bad. But I guess I'm wondering, when you returned back to wanting to have yoga be more of your focus, was that before or after everything that kind of happened with the scandal around your dad?
It was before, but certainly I think the whole scandal and everything was a great opportunity to practice everything that I had learned and that yoga is all about, for sure.
I guess my only real question, because frankly, in the past, I've tried to talk about scandals in a way they just thought wasn't very useful. But the question I have with your dad is, and this is a bigger question I have just in terms of different philosophical viewpoints in yoga, is that there's all these instances. One of the things that's really changed, I mentioned early on that back in the day, there were these gurus who were the authorities, and many of those gurus have passed. And there's been all these scandals. And it seems to me that one of the big issues when those things have happened has been around like certain teachings, namely like, let's say, a practice of celibacy as being necessary to achieve higher states or stages or something. And I've had many people come on and talk about ascetic paths. And I think you can make a strong case that when you remove yourself from the world in certain ways, just to focus on certain things, I could see there being a depth to that you couldn't get when you live in the world in a way. But I also feel like there's a certain thing about like hierarchical power structures, where the idea that somebody who's able to renounce and is celibate is somehow higher in a way, and people put them up on those kinds of pedestals. And that's why when it's revealed that they're actually just regular human beings, then there's these kind of downfalls. So I guess how over the years has the teachings evolved, and what are the teachings around celibacy now compared to then?
Yeah. Well, I think you touched on something really important, which was this whole idea that we make like an ideal spiritual image, like this is the image of what spiritual is. And I personally don't know that one is better than the other. I think it's all about self-empowerment and trust, because look, all the teachings of yoga were designed to help us reveal our personal connection to the source as we experience it to be. So all of the teachings from everywhere, in my mind, are designed to, it's like, look in this direction, look in this direction. But ultimately, it's up to us to have an empowered relationship with those teachings and say, does this fit me? What is the best way that I am going to create a relationship and find my way back to the source, the peace, the presence that we are? And that's not really for anybody to decide except for who we are, except us, So for one way, it will be the path of celibacy. For somebody else, it will be the householder path. But I do see that in the yoga world, not just with celibacy, but with so many different things, we've created this image of what quote unquote spiritual is. And then we all have to live up to it and try to pretend that we're all doing it perfectly when we're not, because we're human beings first. I remember being a kid and at the ashram, and somebody said, I told them that we had pizza for dinner or something. And they were like, you eat pizza? Like it was like earth shattering for them, And so
but is that because there was like strict rules at the ashram and they weren't allowed to eat pizza?
I think there was pizza night. We had dessert night. No, it wasn't that. I think it was just like these concepts that we develop around the person who's spiritual, and right. And even at the ashram, I don't think I'm outing anybody by, even if ice cream wasn't allowed, how many people did I see down at the ice cream store?
That's so funny that you say that, because I've made that joke in the past that like people who say you can't eat this or that, they always get busted with a pint of Haagen-Dazs.
Right.
That's always the joke I've made specifically.
Yeah, so I don't know that there is really one right way. I think that's really what it comes back to. And the more that we can, allow for the fact that, you can be a spiritual being on a spiritual quest and have your ice cream too. It's not, doesn't have to be earth shattering. And the more that we develop that real and genuine relationship with what works for each of us personally, the less we have to live up to some kind of prescribed idea of what spiritual is. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I do think that's that idea of it coming from an agency within you and a discernment within you is the difference between those people who were able to hold relationship to a guru who didn't live up to everything they had imagined them to be in a way that was okay, and then other people who weren't, because a lot of people did give over certain like agency in themselves to look at someone else as the person who would know more than them. And I guess the question is, teachers, the dialogue these days is about the way that teachers, sometimes their charisma gets the best of them and it ends up being manipulative and abusive. And I guess that's the kind of cautionary tale that a lot of us have tried to take from things that have like happened, like with your dad. Mm-hmm. And can I don't know if you really feel comfortable talking about it or how much you want to talk about it, but I am curious, like what was like for you when all of that went down.
Well, I think first of all, I think that no matter where we sat around this event or any other, it's so interesting how one event we each take personally based on what's incomplete for us and where we happen to be sitting around that particular experience. It's like different facets of a diamond. And so for me, of course, where I was sitting, it looked different from the perspective that other people took. And that's not to discount anybody else's. Mm-hmm. But I think that what's the same is the pain, right? The pain that we feel. And it's easy to put it outside of us on, that situation or that person or that thing or whatever. And ultimately, I think the journey for me was, okay, but what is this telling me about me? And because I think many of us do with people who we love is we make their pain our pain. We make their journey our journey. And I was like, okay, so why is this triggering me so personally, so deeply? And what I recognized was that it had to do with my fear, like a very deep pattern of not being loved. And that was in me, right? So the situation outside helped me see what was incomplete within me. And that, I think what was empowering about that is that was something I could do. That was something that I could work on. That was something that I could change within myself. Because look, I can't change what happened outside. The only thing that I can do is, okay, what is there for me to take away from this and for me to learn with this? That I can do something about. And so for me, that's my understanding of karma is, my dad has this great quote that I didn't understand for a lot of years, but I do now. Karma is not what happens to you. Karma is how you are with what happens to you. So what happened was the result. It was the effect of everything that came before. But ultimately for me, it's not what's coming to me, but how I am with what comes to me. And if I use it in a way that's, okay, what can I learn? How can I move forward? How can I use this as a cautionary tale of how I want to move forward in life? That so-called, quote unquote, bad karma could become good karma based on how I choose to deal with it. And so it didn't happen overnight, but certainly that was the place where I found my completion and the peace, which was make this into something that carries me forward into life rather than crushing me under its weight.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I mean, I don't know, I got stuff with my dad, and in order for me to be well or to know myself more, which it sounds like what you're describing in a way, which maybe they're related, like to heal and to know yourself, but they're like the same in a way. I had to, be able to see my dad for just being another person and find where I learned from him and learn from the parts of him that, were painful or whatever, like you say. So that seems to me an important part of life. And like you said, why do we expect it to be different of people who are yoga teachers.
Yeah,
we have an idea of spiritual or whatever, like you said, right?
Totally. And you said something, and what triggered in me was this whole, like for me, yes, I learned from my dad's strengths, but I also learned equally, if not more, from his weaknesses. Mm-hmm. And that's the beauty, is if we truly take it in this way, like nothing can be, like it's all on how we take it. But I would argue that I even said to my dad at one point, I said, I didn't learn the most from you in how you went through, being at the top of, being honored and respected by all these people. Yeah, you learned something, but how you behave when you're down, when you're destroyed, when your ego is being destroyed before the world, and how you behave then, that's something to learn too. How do you go through that? How do you face that?
You get to see how good your yoga practice is.
Exactly. That's when you really prove how good your yoga practices are.
I mean, that's maybe a value, but you know what I mean? How well it works for you, like how useful it is for you,
Exactly. I mean, does it suddenly disappear when you're in the midst of difficulty, or is that the very moment when you pick it up and you really start practicing? Because let's face it, that what we do on the yoga mat is really practice for what we're all inevitably going to face in some way or the other in life.
Yeah.
Whether it's difficulty in a scandal or an illness or a loss of a loved one, we're all going to face something painful. But how are we going to practice? That's the thing.
Right. And was there like a moment for you, like when you decided, like, yes, I'm going to make yoga my thing and I'm going to be the Yogeshwari of this lineage? Like, was there something where you that motivated you to decide, yes, I am going to do this?
Well, I'm going to be honest, because even though I picked up these teachings early, I kind of rediscovered them and loved them for myself. For many, many years, I was, many words, scared, terrified, overwhelmed by the idea of being the carrier of the lineage. Yeah. Because it felt like a lot of pressure. Go ahead.
It feels like a lot of pressure to me.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not like, oh yeah, sure, I'll do that. Yeah. And certainly seeing, what happened with my dad, it's not like an open invitation,
That's what I mean. Like the title and the sometimes pedestal that can come with it.
Exactly. And I wanted to be able to go out dancing with my friends and have a good time and be a human being and have that space. And so for a long time, it was something that I kind of held off and pushed away. And because I didn't want to have to live up to somebody's ideal of who I should be, But then slowly I realized that I actually don't have to be anybody else. Mm. And that is actually the power of being expressly authentic as I can be, and a human being, and bringing that to the table as the carrying forward of lineage. That it doesn't have to look like how my dad did it or how Swami Kripalu did it before him. It can look like me, because that's the most authentic thing that I have to offer.
Yeah, that sounds true to me. And I guess for me, there's also been a thing, and I'm wondering if it's true for you, that part of it has also been having a certain transparency and talking openly about ourselves in ways that maybe our teachers didn't. Because I had teachers who were wonderful teachers, but they weren't necessarily, relating to me. Because again, there was a kind of guru-disciple relationship that still had remnants in the teaching styles of certain teachers. As opposed to, I became inspired by the teachings of TKV Desikachar, where a lot of his teaching was about this kind of interpersonal relationship that involved more transparency around the teacher, maybe. So I'm just curious, is that an element for you, or is there still a certain formality around the way that you present teachings?
No, I would say that I'm more, like you said, a little bit more deliberately transparent. And I think that's another takeaway. We learn not just from what our teachers do well, but maybe what they don't do so well. And we can see it. And if we trust ourselves to go, I think that this message would be even more empowering, more widely received, if I show that no, you don't have to, you can still have your Haagen-Dazs and be a contribution to humanity, and that's okay. Yeah. And in fact, being honest about the fact that we have physical and emotional pain, that we go through difficulty, this lets everybody off the hook and lets us all recognize, like, look, we are all on the same human journey. We're all helping each other. We're all helping each other along the way. And I think that transparency is a really big part of moving forward and helping create that empowerment among the people that we serve.
I think that's right too. And I noticed that your more recent focus, I don't know if this is like what you specialize in. I know you teach a lot of different things, but you spend a lot of time teaching yoga nidra. Why did that end up becoming a focus for you?
So it was actually a couple of reasons. One was that I suffered a really bad back injury. I went through a period of time where, I find that sometimes I learn more. Maybe it's just me, but I think a lot of people, we learn more from pain, the difficult times in our life than the easy times. And yes, I went through a period.
Both kinds, the physical back pain kind as well as the emotional, spiritual kind, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so I went through a period of kind of suppressing myself, compromising my own needs and my own voice in the name of giving to others. And eventually that showed up in my body because, my body was like, well, if you won't speak up, then I will speak up for you, kind of thing. And it was really then that I had no choice but to discover the more inward practices of yoga, because I could not do the physical yoga practices. And discovered, even though Yoga Nidra has always been a part of this lineage, just discovered that actually all 8 limbs of yoga are contained within the practice of Yoga Nidra. We start with some stretching. We go into breath work, pranayam. We pull our outward attention inward, pratyahara. We use the body rotations, the nyasa, as dharana, as a point of concentration, which takes us to meditative awareness, dhyana, and eventually to a mini experience of samadhi where we dissolve into the whole. And so what I discovered was that it's a great way for people who automatically deselect themselves from a yoga class to just reduce the threshold and get everybody experiencing the power of yoga, even those who think they would never set foot into a traditional yoga class.
Interesting. I've heard people describe Yoga Nidra in other ways too. Is the way that you're teaching it how your father taught you, or have you incorporated from other kind of resources as well?
It's mostly based on our lineage and tradition. So I would definitely say I've taken what he has taught me and then I built on that as well. Of course, I think all styles are related as well, just like all styles of yoga have interconnections and overlapping areas. But I would say it's more or less unique to our approach to this lineage. Okay.
And I guess what's interesting there also for me is Yoga Nidra is often a very accessible entry point for people, like you said, like an opportunity for people who maybe are less interested in other kinds of more dynamic asana practices. But I guess where you landed, I started our conversation today when you talk about merging into an infinite consciousness. I can't remember the exact word you just used. That's the kind of last layer that not everyone goes to. And I guess that does bring me to where I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, there was a convergence earlier today for me, because one of the conversations I've been having on the show of late is wanting to ask teachers about, sometimes the word I use is intuition or spirit, or if it feels comfortable enough, even God, which yoga teachers sort of avoid like a plague, it seems. And I think the questions that have really arose had to do with, first, before we get to higher power, even just the idea of energy and consciousness. And everybody in the room seemed to be very okay with the idea that everything's made of energy. But when you try to go from energy to consciousness, and then they're like, but wait, are you saying rocks have a spirit? I don't know if I can go there. You know what I mean? There's a certain leap from energy to consciousness or something. And like I said, I heard you talking about this ocean metaphor earlier today. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about everything being made of energy and how that relates potentially to consciousness and our connection to a universal consciousness.
Of course, yeah. So this metaphor that I like to use is of the ocean and waves. So think of the ocean, that is consciousness. So it has no beginning or no end. It's eternal. There's nothing that can be added or taken away from it. It's timeless. It's formless. But from that consciousness comes these waves. And the waves have a beginning and an end. And each wave is a form, a visible form of the invisible source from which it came. And so think of everything on the wave level as being made of prana or energy. And they are the manifest aspect of the one, of consciousness, of the one source or presence, whatever you want to call it. But the difference being that on the wave level, any wave that lives.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.